Hate America rally that's scheduled for October 18th on the National Mall, and it's being told to us that they won't be able to reopen the government until after that rally because they can't face their rabid base. And I'm beyond words. I can't believe they're actually doing this.
I mean, this is weak leadership at one of the greatest levels I've ever seen. It is a weak leader who says that dissent is unpatriotic. We are a nation founded in this idea of protest. What was the Boston Tea Party all about? What was the protest of our founders against an oppressive government?
Let's talk about the Boston Tea Party for a second. Because it was about, no taxation without representation, whatever, right? But there was also much more to that. In fact, tea prices were actually cheaper at the time when they protested. And the event that directly caused the Boston Tea Party was the Tea Act of 1773. And as I said, it wasn't a new tax. It actually made tea cheaper. See, what happened was that the British East India Company was on the verge of bankruptcy, and they were sitting on a huge surplus of tea. So the Crown fucking bailed out the company with the Tea Act, which gave the company a monopoly on tea sales in the American colonies. It allowed the company to ship tea directly to the colonies, bypassing colonial merchants, and sell it for a lower price, even lower than the tea that was getting smuggled in from Dutch tea. And so the colonists saw the Tea Act as like a real sinister and like clever trap, right? Yeah, the colonial merchants, John Hancock, who had been smuggling that Dutch tea, would be put out of business by this. He's the one that actually was help funding that group, Sons of Liberty. And so by making the British tea cheaper, Parliament hoped that colonists would abandon their principles and buy the taxed tea, effectively accepting Parliament's right to tax them, because they made the tea cheaper. But then the colonists were also worried about, they had a real fear precedent over this too, because if the British government could grant a monopoly on tea, what's to stop them to create monopolies on other essential goods like cloth, paper, glass, stuff like that? And it was seen as a dangerous expansion of centralized control over the colonial economy. And actually, what's funny about the Boston Tea Party is when it happened is that the other colonists were like, whoa, dude, holy shit, what the fuck are you guys doing up there? But it was the Crown's response that kind of started uniting the colonists. Up in Boston, they were known as the radical Bostonians, or, the radical Whigs. Down south, you had, the conservative Whigs. They were more in line with, the Tories at the time. So what you had then, basically, was that the British Crown, through the Tea Act, passed legislation specifically to bail out the East India Company, which was a massive politically connected conglomerate that was too big to fail, right? And this government intervention directly distorted the market, crushed smaller competitors. Think of Walmart coming into your small town. And of course, we've been watching that with our government for the last, 10, 20 years or whatever, with the TARP bailouts in 2008, the CARES Act in 2020. But what we're starting to see with the fucking Trump administration is strategic investment and taking ownership, a stake in fucking different companies. And Scott Bessent actually says that they're planning on taking on more equity and more different companies across various industries. So obviously you can see this might create a little bit of a similar dynamic, right? We're really getting into a situation where the government's really going to be picking winners and losers now, favoring large, systematically important companies over smaller ones, and potentially using that ownership to exert control and consolidate. Now, obviously the modern concern isn't about legal monopoly like the East India Company had. It's more about de facto, in practice, just a straight up advantage. We're really starting to watch really bad cronyism and unfair competition. A small business or startup has to compete on an uneven playing field against a giant corporation that has the U.S. government as its part owner and financial fucking backstop. And believe me when I say this will absolutely stifle innovation and entrench corporate power. And along with that corporate power, you got some real political control. When the government is a major shareholder, it can influence fucking corporate policy, in ways that might not be exactly fucking purely market driven, right? For example, pushing certain environmental, social, political agendas through its voting power that it now has. And what fucking worries me the most is now this really creates an atmosphere where CEOs will probably really engage in kind of fucking real risky behavior because we're just creating a bunch of too big to fail fucking companies. So you can see we're kind of fostering that same kind of environment, with the Boston Tea Party and everything. But the real modern concern, obviously nowadays, is like the real market distortion, the entrenchment of like corporate giants, the blurring of lines between state and corporate power. Pretty much textbook fascism. Anyway, good talk.